Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Professor Kyle back again with another recorded lecture in anticipation of a practicum exam. Today we are going to be discussing muscles. The format of this lecture, though, will be a little bit different than what we did in class. I am going to go over the entirety of the presentation, the lecture component that we did in class. That'll be this first part. I might try to do it a little bit faster than I did in class because on the tail end of this, we are going to go through a second PowerPoint courtesy of a friend of mine who's another faculty member. And that is going to be a presentation on just the muscles themselves, but actually on the physical models that we'll be utilizing for the practicum exam. So I know this particular topic is a point of somewhat apprehension for students when it comes to prepping. So I'm going to try and spend a little bit more time with this. And that last third of this lecture, if you feel good on the content of the lecture component, you can, my feelings won't be hurt. You feel free to skip to the end of this video. Because when we go through the model itself, I think that'll be the highest yield thing for you guys in anticipation for our practicum next week. So that being said, let's go ahead and hop on in. If you're a stranger from the internet, welcome. I'm posting this for my purposeful students, but it's technically available on the internet. Now, when it comes to our discussion of muscles, we should note, as we've discussed previously, that there are three main types of muscle fibers, three main types of tissue, two of which are involuntary, meaning we do not exert conscious control over them. Those are smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Where do we find these sorts of fibers? Well, smooth muscle, we find lining a lot of our internal organs, all of our vasculature, right? Our blood vessels and such. Smooth muscle allows us to regulate blood pressure and shunt blood flow to different portions of the body as needed. It's also accomplishing things such as the process of peristalsis to move, basically sequentially squeezing the intestines to move food through our digestive system. Things of that nature. And then over here we have cardiac muscle, right? Which we only find in one place, and as the name suggests, that is found in the heart. And it's a good thing we don't have voluntary control over these things. Otherwise, you would forget to digest your food, and you would forget to, well, have your heart beat, and we would die very quickly. The third category is skeletal muscle. This is where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Skeletal muscle, we do have voluntary control over. Our cerebral cortex can send signals to our cerebellum, which is mapping out complex movements and sent down efferent motor neurons, a whole shebang, eventually resulting in muscle contraction and ultimately movement of our body. So that's going to be the main topic of today. Now, again, these next couple of slides, just like I mentioned in lecture, these are not going to be the content upon which the exam is based, but just to make sure we're all on relatively the same page, we're going to do a brief overview of the general structure of muscle fibers. Now, supporting muscles don't work by themselves. If we didn't have our connective tissue, such as our bones and tendons and ligaments, we would just be a gelatinous mess. We'd be, well, actually, I was going to say Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars, but even Jabba has at least an axial skeleton of sorts. But obviously, we need other supporting connective tissue in order for all of this to work. So we have bones, which is that rigid connective tissue that is allowing us to exert leverage against. And then we have tendons and ligaments that are essentially acting as the glue. They're mediating all the bonds between the muscles and the bones. Then, of course, we have skeletal muscle themselves, right? And as I mentioned in lecture, technically, by definition, every skeletal muscle is its own organ, right? It's a series of tissues organized for a common purpose, okay? When it comes to these individual muscles, these individual muscle organs, the external lining, okay, the perimeter of these is called the epimysium. It's a form of connective tissue, and that is delineating each muscle from another, even its adjacent neighbors. Within that, we have the kind of basically the functional units. These are bundles of muscle fibers, individual muscle fibers, called fascicles, and the lining of a muscle fascicle, so this entire thing is the fascicle. The lining of that is called the perimysium, okay? And then within that, we have individual muscle fibers, which are individual cells, the lining of which is called the endomysium, right over here, okay? Endo meaning like inside, so it's the most interior layer. All right, taking this individual muscle fiber and zooming in even further, we now see that listed here. Within inside a muscle cell, we have these structures called myofibrils or myofibrils, however you want to pronounce it. Excuse me. Those myofibrils are the functional units within inside of the cell that are accomplishing the process of contraction. They are what are squeezing and decreasing the longitudinal size of the muscle fiber. By the time we get to these two illustrations right here, the sarcomere and then the subcomponents of the sarcomere being the myosin and individual myosin and actin filaments, we are essentially looking at the molecular level. So we are very, very, very zoomed in on this structure. In fact, by the time we get to these individual heads of the myosin filament that are ratcheting against the actin filament, each one of those heads, every time it ratchets, burns one ATP molecule, which is obviously a very small molecule. We pop that phosphate group off as a part of the process of muscle contraction. So this is very, very zoomed in. And then, of course, just a brief little quick summary of like, well, how is this process of muscle activation occurring? So we have efferent motor neurons. Again, I kind of mentioned earlier, cerebral cortex is going to say, hey, we need to move a muscle fiber. Your cerebellum, the back portion of your brain, is responsible for essentially orchestrating complex motor movements. Fine dexterity, think of like playing piano or the process of walking, that sort of stuff. And that is going to then send down efferent motor neurons. So again, we have efferent and afferent neurons. Afferent are basically inbound signals back to the central nervous system. Efferent is outbound signals from the central nervous system. And then usually 2 to 3 neurons later, we eventually reach the muscle fibers themselves. And the junction point between the efferent motor neuron and the muscle fibers is called the neuromuscular junction, listed right here. It's maybe not super clear because of how small the text is, but the neuromuscular junction at which neurotransmitters are released. Typically, in this case, it would be acetylcholine, and that is what is going to trigger the excitation / depolarization, large voltage shift in the muscle tissue itself. That ultimately initiating the cascade of the muscle contraction, which is then going to be the ratcheting motion of these two filaments on top of each other, decreasing their longitudinal length. Interesting fact about myosin and actin filaments in that process of ATP consumption that they are involved in that I mentioned in class was, dead tissue, dead fibers. If you've ever, I mentioned in class that my cat killed a rat, right? Big old 6-inch long rat. He's crazy. His name's Hunter, and he lives up to it. But when you pick up a dead carcass like that, it's very stiff, right? The body is very stiff. You might think, oh, it's because it's cold or whatever, something along those lines. It actually has to do with essentially like the molecular biology or the biochemistry of how these myosin and actin filaments work. So the point at which that ATP is consumed is actually essentially at the end of the ratcheting system. It's when the system resets. It's when it disengages that we pop off that phosphate group. And the physiological consequence of that reality is in the case of a dead tissue, where again, there's no new energy being sent into the system essentially becomes stuck in whatever ratchet or whatever orientation it currently is, because there's no new ATP getting sent to allow the system to reset. So when you are like moving dead muscle tissue, it's essentially like Velcro in a lot of senses. So you're having to tear those bonds that are being made because there's no ATP to allow them to naturally reset. So that phenomenon with dead tissue is called rigor mortis, right? So rigor means basically straight or stiff, and then mortis obviously refers to death in Latin. So that's a phenomenon there. Anyways, just little physiology side note before we get too deep into the weeds of just rote anatomy. Now, speaking of rote anatomy and lots of names, we have a lot of names to know when it comes to the muscular system. Certainly a lot to learn in a week. But luckily, in some cases, there are some hints built into the names that will help us either figure out where the muscle is or what the muscle does, those sorts of things. And it has to do with these different naming conventions that are sometimes applied to the muscles. So for example, sometimes the muscle location is a large hint to the name. Example would be the temporalis. Okay, we have the temporalis muscle, which is located on the side of your head, and the reason it's called the temporalis is because it sits on top of the temporal bone, right? We can also have the muscle shape. Sometimes we just look at a muscle and be like, hey, that looks like a trapezoid in this case. So we have the trapezius muscle on the back. It's the most superficial muscle on the middle of your back, on your dorsal surface. And if you take the two halves of the muscle, it looks essentially like a diamond or like a trapezoid. And so we call it the trapezius. We can also have muscle size. So we have 3 primary gluteal muscles. They are all in roughly the same location, doing roughly the same thing. So you might be inclined to name them the same thing. But obviously, they're discrete muscles, so we need to have some way to distinguish them. And so we simply relied basically on the relative or average size of the different muscle fibers. So we have the gluteus maximus muscle, which is the largest of the 3. We can have the direction of the muscle fibers. So we have the rectus abdominis, which we'll see in a few slides. But we also have the transverse abdominis, which is basically running perpendicular in orientation. Rectus means kind of vertical or tall. And so those are the fibers running in the vertical orientation, and then transverse are going to be the ones running perpendicular to that. The number of origins, basically the kind of origin insertion arrangement of a muscle, can sometimes provide us with a name. Think of the bicep on your arm, right? So that has two heads that attach up here. And so we therefore call it, because of those two heads, we call it the bicep muscle. The same thing applies to the tricep on the posterior portion of your humerus. We have the location of the attachments, okay? So we have this, the best example of this is the sternocleidomastoid. Okay, I know that's a rather scary word, but if we break it down, it's actually pretty intuitive and pretty helpful as far as names go. So we have sterno, that's referring to the sternum, okay? So that's its origin point right here. And then we have cleido. This is referring to clavicle, so kind of emphasize the cl sound in it. So that's referring to the second origin. And then we have mastoid, and we have the mastoid process of the occipital bone on the kind of posterior and inferior surface of the skull. And that is the muscle insertion, right? So we have two origins and one insertion. So sternocleidomastoid, as strange as that word and name is actually very beneficial, very useful for defining where this muscle is. And even what it's attached to is built into the name. And then lastly, we have things like muscle action. So we'll see in the forearm, and the forearm is a relatively more time-consuming muscle group to study. So we have the flexor muscles of the forearm. Okay, so those are flexing the muscle, and then we also have the extenders or extensor muscles, which are extending the hand. Okay. Some other notes, didn't really know where else to put these, so I just kind of shoved them in here. When it comes to naming origins and insertions, please tell me I'm recording. Okay, I am. One time I did the majority of a lecture before realizing I wasn't recording, and that was a very sad day. When it comes to origins and insertions, okay, there's no hard and fast rule as to which is which, but generally speaking, the intent behind the name is that the origin is the portion that is not moving, or at least moving less, and the insertion is going to be attached to a surface that is moving significantly when the muscle, the associated muscle, contracts. Okay, think of like your latissimus dorsi, so your lat muscles. Okay, so the origins are down on your hip. We'll see that later because that's one of the muscles we need to know the origins and insertions of. And so those portions obviously don't really move too much because it's very close to the middle of your body. However, the attachment on the upper surface, upper edge of your humerus is obviously moving a significant amount if you're doing like a pulling motion, right? Like doing a pull-up. So therefore, this would be called the insertion up here on the humerus, and we would call the hip attachment the origin, okay? Iliac crest specifically. Then we have three related terms. We have the muscle agonist, we have the antagonist, and we have the synergist. Okay, so an agonist is the muscle that is primarily responsible for affecting a particular movement. Okay, it is the guy doing the majority of the work. Think of like your bicep and flexion of your arm. Okay, so when your bicep contracts, it's pulling your arm, it's flexing your arm inwards, reducing this angle. Conversely, we have a muscle antagonist. Okay, antagonist is reversing or otherwise opposes. Sorry, I'm getting notifications. Otherwise opposes the function or the contraction of an agonist. So continuing with the arm as the example, because it's very intuitive. So if the bicep was to be still the agonist, right? So we're reducing this angle, we're flexing the arm. Conversely, the tricep on the posterior surface of your arm would be the antagonist. Okay, so when that contracts, it would reverse the work of the bicep. Some reasons that would be useful. Well, first of all, it allows us to rapidly reset a joint, right? Rapidly reset an angle. We're not passively, like if I contract my bicep and I want to re-extend on my arm, I'm not passively relying on relaxing the tension in that muscle and then gravity to pull my arm down. That would be a very slow and inefficient process. Instead, I can alternatively contract my tricep, and that will rapidly re-extend, like relax the bicep, contract the tricep, and that will rapidly re-extend the arm. And then to more precisely control movement, this is essentially saying that, you know, not only when it comes to how hard we're pulling on something, not only can we regulate how hard the agonist muscle is contracting to exert that force, but we can also add basically a little bit of an antagonistic force, a little bit of pushback on that, and that allows us to exert a finer degree of control over particular movements. And then lastly, we have synergist. Synergist is a relatively general category of just anything that is, enhancing or otherwise supporting the action of the agonist, right? So it's typically like stabilizing a joint, that sort of stuff, potentially providing some form of contraction to help the work of the agonist, but it's not the primary driver of the movement. All right. Last couple of kinesiology related terms. Origin insertion, actually, we're going to skip this one because we already discussed it pretty much at length. In terms of action, okay, so we actually commonly use these terms, but they are technical terms that we should note the definition of. So I already mentioned that with the bicep. If you flex your bicep, that process is called flexion because that is reducing, and like try and visualize this, that is reducing the overall angle of your arm, okay? Got to like work within the limits of like, see like the edge of my green screen. Conversely, we have extension, which is increasing the angle of a joint, okay? So that would be the work of the tricep to straighten the arm. Then we have abduction, or abduction and adduction. So abduction, ab means away in Latin, okay? So that is to move away from the midline. So think of like almost like flapping your wings, that upward motion out to the side, moving away from the center line of your body would be considered abduction. And then adduction, ad means to, towards, or near in Latin. And so that is moving towards the midline. So that would be the process of bringing your arms down closer to your side. Excuse me. All right, a couple other terms. We have pronation and supination or supination. I don't really care as long as you remember the words and how to spell them. So pronation with the radius, we've discussed previously how you can rotate the radius inward, and that's how you can tell that you're dealing with the radius, whereas the ulna doesn't really rotate very much. So that process of rotating medially or towards the middle is the process of pronation. Okay, that would be a pronating movement. And then supination is the opposite of that. Supination would be like rotating laterally or to the outside edge. Okay. Supination, however you want to pronounce it. In terms of action, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. All right, this one's a little bit more of an annoying in terms of naming convention. Dorsiflexion makes pretty intuitive sense. I'm going to use my arm as if it was my foot, but that is the process of moving like your flexing your toes upwards. Okay, so lifting your toes, your foot upwards. Makes sense because you're reducing this angle right here, right? Plantar flexion, okay, so intuitively, I and many others, you probably included, would like to think that this would most logically be named extension because that's kind of the relationship that we've established thus far. Instead, we call it plantar flexion. I don't know why it's not called extension. I do know why it is called plantar flexion. The reason it's called plantar flexion is because this inferior surface of your foot has a tissue or an area called the plantar fascia. Okay, that is part of the sole of your foot. And since we are moving in the direction of the sole of your foot, we call it plantar flexion because it's in the direction of that tissue. Another example of like plantar fascia would be plantar fasciitis, which is just like inflammation of the sole of your foot, right? Itis, whenever you attach itis to the end of a statement, it just means inflammation of whatever the thing is that you just said. So yeah, fun little side fact there. All right, with all that being said, we are now ready to launch into the muscles themselves. Again, I'm trying to make this lecture a little bit faster, especially since we're going to go over a lot of this again on the tail end. So I'm just going to kind of hit the high points. Epicranius, this big guy up here, okay, we're going to see this multiple times. Epicranius is sometimes subdivided into two individual muscles because there are two muscle bellies to it with a significant amount of connective tissue. But for our purposes, we're just going to refer to it as the epicranius. When you did your model in class, you would have found two numbers, anterior and posterior for this one. Orbicularis oculi, that is rounding the eye, the big hints there, right? Okay, orbiculars, think of like circle, right? Orbits. And then oculi, ocular, think eye, right? So that is this guy right here. Levator labii superiosus. All right, so when it comes to these guys, we can get into the weeds of the nuances of facial expression. The easiest memory tool that I can give with these front-facing muscles is when you hear levator, think kind of upper lip, think upwards, think levitate. And then when you hear depressor, think inferior, think lower. Okay, so when we think levator labii, we're going to look right over here with this line right here. And so basically on the medial portion of the upper lip is attachment. So this is involved in lifting your upper lip to a certain degree and part of the process of smiling. That is going to be the levator labii superiosus. Do not confuse it with the zygomaticus, although they are next door neighbors. The zygomaticus is going to be more lateral relative to it and more directly attaching to the zygomatic bone, as you can see right here. Um, Zygomaticus we'll talk more about in a little bit. Okay, now we have the two depressor. So mentalis is labeled here. That is basically where the little divot of your chin is. We're not worrying too much about that for our purposes. Depressor labii is the next door neighbor. Okay, so it is on the anterior surface and is middle medial of the three sets of muscles right here. And then lastly, on the more lateral side, we have the anguli oris. Okay, this guy right here. So that'd be these two right here. So again, depressor labii inferioris is more medial relative to depressor anguli oris, which is going to be the more lateral portion. Orbicularis, okay, so same word we saw here. So this is a circular muscle fiber orientation. But this time, instead of oculi for eye, we have oris. Think oral, think speaking, okay? So this is lining your mouth. Leave it at that. We don't need to go further for the purposes of this class. Then we have the mentalis. Okay, so we do talk about the mentalis. My apologies. I couldn't remember. There was another muscle in the face that we're not talking about. So we have the right and left mentalis muscles right here. These are the most medial on the mandible, okay? And then we have the buccinator or the buccinator is how we would jokingly refer to it in class as an easy way to remember the name because it kind of sounds like a funny like pirate word. Is this guy right here? Do not confuse it with the masseter. Okay, the masseter is what you should think of with your jaw. It provides the majority of the bite force. The buccinator is directly anterior, but also slightly deep relative to the masseter. And it is more of, think of it being more a part of your cheek rather than a part of your bite force. Okay. Masseter we'll talk about in a moment. And then temporalis we've already spoken about being on the side of the head. Cool. If a muscle is labeled in red, those are muscles that we need to know the origin and insertion of. If you're a stranger on the internet, that's not relevant to you, but if you are one of my students, it certainly is. So in the instances where we need to know origin insertion, we have a slide dedicated to that. So we have the zygomaticus. And so as the name implies, its origin is on the zygomatic bone. And then its insertion. So this is one of those interesting points about facial muscles. Facial muscles oftentimes are inserting either on each other, on other muscles, or like inserting onto the skin, the epidermis itself. That's why they're so good at facial expressions and nuances of the superficial surface. So insertion is on the orbicularis oris of the mouth. Okay. Then actions, obviously, it's involved in smiling. So happy. All right, then we have masseter. Okay, so also origin is on the zygomatic bone right here. Okay, again, we mentioned during the cranial lecture that the zygomatic process, that big kind of protrusion, that your cheekbone, is useful because it just dramatically increases surface area for attachment of muscles. And then its insertion is on the angle of the mandible down right along here. Okay, so we would have the mandible bone running like this, so it's inserting down here. And again, it's involved in chewing, right? It's the majority of your bite force. Muscles of the neck, there's a lot more muscles of the neck that we're not talking about, but we're just going to focus on some of the main ones. We have the platysma, which if you like stretch your neck right here, okay, you see how taut my neck becomes. That is this muscle right here, the platysma. Then we have the sternocleidomastoid that we've spoken about before, and luckily that name is very convenient because we have the two origins. We have the sternum and the clavicle right along here, okay? And then we have the insertion on the mastoid process, okay, up over here. Cool. Scalenes, these three guys, scalene muscles. We'll mention them more when we get to the physical model, but they're supportive muscles of the neck. And then we have the digastric. Okay, digastric is attaching to this hyaloid bone right here. Actually, we might as well just jump to the next slide because we're going to talk about that there. Yeah. So circling back, sternocleidomastoid, we already basically talked about this. Manubrium of the sternum, so that's that little kind of ridge line right here at the top of the sternum. And the clavicle, cool, mastoid process, neck flexion. Okay. Basically, the primary driver of stabilizing your neck. Then we have the digastric. Okay, so origin is on the mandible, and insertion is on this hyoid bone right here. Okay, so this guy right there, and it's part of pulling open your mouth. Obviously, therefore, it's also related a little bit to swallowing, things of that nature. So Just remember, like the hyoid bone is probably the most interesting part about that. All right, muscles of the anterior surface of the basically of the torso, thorax, shoulder, and abdomen. We have the pectoralis major. Pectoralis major is this big guy right here, juxtaposed to the pectoralis minor. So you won't be able to visualize this on our physical models because the superficial pectoralis major doesn't pop off. But just know that the pectoralis minor is technically there, but it's a much more minor contributor to the overall contraction of your chest, or like your pushing strength, which again is still technically a pulling motion, but we think of it anecdotally as a pushing motion. We have the serratus anterior, which are these guys over here on the sides, okay, kind of up under your armpit. And then we have the deltoid. The deltoid, these are your big boulder shoulders, okay, when you're working out your arms. Those are your deltoid muscles. They attach to the deltoid tuberosity on your humerus that we've spoken about previously. That's where it inserts over here. We have pectoralis minor, which we already mentioned. External and internal intercostals. These are two layers of muscles that line your rib cage. There's two layers, internal, external. Easy. And the function therein is involved in respiration, right? So if all of these muscles contract, that would essentially pull up and out the rib cage, which would increase the thoracic space, and therefore create a negative pressure within your lungs, which will help pull air in, right, to fill in that space. Then we have the diaphragm. Diaphragm is not particularly well visualized, but just imagine it being basically along this surface right here, okay? Also involved in respiration. We have the rectus abdominis. Again, not doing a lot of physiology, just focusing on the anatomy because that's going to be most of what the test is. We have the rectus abdominis. This is the most superficial layer of 4 layers on the abdominal wall. And this is typically what you think of with your abs, right? If you think of celebrities and that sort of stuff, superheroes, the rectus abdominis is going to be the ab muscles. We have the external and internal obliques over here on the side, okay? That's basically all we need to know. So this, again, this is the more superficial half, and this is the more deep half of the muscles. And then we have the transverse abdominis, which we'll talk about next, along with the obliques again. Okay, so we have the rectus abdominis here on a superficial layer. Then we have the external and internal abdominal obliques. Okay, so these guys right here, then these guys right here. And then the most deep layer is going to be the transverse abdominis, and that is running perpendicular, as we've already mentioned, to the rectus abdominis muscle. Cool. Muscles we need to know the origin and insertion of: pectoralis major. These are your big chest muscles, the primary driver in like a bench press motion, okay? Origin on the clavicle and sternum, okay? So it's inserting along, or originating along here and along here on your sternum. And then insertion is on the upper humerus, okay, over here on the side. So when you push a bench press, you're technically pulling your arm forward relative to your pec, because this muscle is contracting to pull your arm forward. So it flexes, immediately rotates the arm. We have the deltoid, which we mentioned before, right? That big, your shoulder muscle. Origin on the clavicle and scapula, okay? And then insertion on the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus, okay? Right here, that rough surface, a slight protrusion, but generally just speaking, a rough surface on your humerus. And is abduction, moving away from the midline, abduction of the arm, lifting up and away. Excuse me. Then we have the rectus abdominis, which we previously discussed. Origin is on the pubic crest of your coxal bone, so down at the base of your abdomen. And then insertion is on the xiphoid process. So that is at the base. If you run along your sternum to the base of your sternum, there's a little pointy bit down at the bottom of that. That is the xiphoid process, okay? And the costal cartilage of your rib cage. So the two lower halves of your rib cage that fan out laterally and inferiorly to the side, attaches to that costal cartilage. And then action is obviously flexion of the spine. Think of like doing a crunch, okay, or sit-up motion. Muscles still on the torso, but now we are looking on the posterior surface. Here, it's kind of flipped in the orientation. So this is going to be the more superficial portion. This is going to be the more deep portion. So we have the trapezius and the latissimus dorsi muscles. We'll talk about those more on the next slide. We have the infraspinatus muscle. Okay, this guy right here. Wait, it's labeled over here. So infraspinatus right here. The infraspinatus inferior, so below spinatus is referring to the spine of the scapula. So this kind of ridge line right here. Okay, so it is below the spine. Then we have teres minor and major. These can sometimes be a sticking point for students. Note that the teres minor is going to be the muscle above the teres major. Depending on the model, probably there might be a bit more of the minor muscle that is visualized more than the major, but note that the major is technically the larger one, hence its name. But it is lower than. So we have the teres major, it's this guy right here. And then teres minor is this little strand here on the side. Okay, maybe I should outline these things rather than just point at them. Decrease my mouse sensitivity. I am not an artist. Okay, so teres minor is that guy right here. Teres major is this guy right here. Okay. What is next? Supraspinatus. Okay, supraspinatus is this little guy right here. Cool. Again, supra on top of the spine of the scapula. Levator scapulae. It's this guy right here. Good. Again, I'm going to kind of fly through this because we're doing this basically twice in this lecture. And then we have rhomboids. Rhomboids are below the trapezius muscle. They are deep to the, sorry, not below, they are deep to the trapezius muscle. These guys right here, but they are essentially doing the same thing. They are stabilizing your back, keeping your scapula close to your axial skeleton, to your rib cage, and also involved in pulling motion when you pull things back. Think of like a rowing motion where you're rotating your scapula forward and then pulling them into a more posterior position. All right, focusing in on the trapezius. So again, it is this big guy right here. And again, when you see the two halves, it looks something like a trapezoid. Okay, terrible drawing, I know. I'm not an artist. Next, with regards to the trapezius muscle, so we have the origin, which is going to be, let me fix my laser pointer. The spinous process of the vertebrae. So we have these guys right here, those bumps that you can feel on the middle of your back. Those are the spinal processes. And those serve processes, as we know, typically serve as attachment points for muscles. Cool. And then insertion on the spine of the scapula. Okay, so along this ridge line right here. That's why we have that very large surface there. Adduction of the scapula, pulling towards the midline. Okay, back in this. Pulling your scapula back towards the middle of your back. Okay. Latissimus dorsi, origin is on the vertebrae and the iliac crest. Okay, so this is the iliac crest of your coxal bones of your hips. So it is attaching there, as well as on your vertebrae along here. Okay. And then insertion is on the upper humerus. So it's kind of hard to visualize, but it's basically up in this region right here. It's deep to what we're currently looking at, but it's up in that region. Again, think of doing a pull-up. You need to pull down your humerus in order to do that. All right. Vertebral associated muscles. So there's more going on here than we are focusing in on. We're just going to focus in on two. You have your erector spinae, or your spinal erector muscles. These are fairly superficial, and these are the two ridge lines that you feel on either side of your spine, kind of running up the whole length. And then in particular on kind of the upper half, 2/3 or so, we have the semispinalis muscles, which are then subdivided based off the region. So on the cervical vertebrae, semispinalis, cervicus, and then thoracis. Okay. Leave it at that. Don't need to go further. We already have enough to cover. Muscles of the arm. Okay, muscles of the arm. We have the bicep on the anterior surface. This big, wait, you can't see. I wish with the pen you could still like see a faint outline of it. That way when I'm gesturing, it still makes sense because I always forget. So we have this guy right here, okay, bicep brachii, two heads inserting up here, which is hence the name. Then we have the brachialis. Brachialis is oftentimes misconstrued as being a part of the your tricep muscle. It is not. It is a unique guy running basically parallel with your humerus. Slight angle, but it's roughly parallel with your humerus on the lateral surface. You can actually see a tiny little bit of it right there. Then we have the tricep brachii, which again, agonist-antagonist relationship with the bicep. So that is the posterior portion. There's technically 3 heads of this, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We do, however, need to know the origin and insertion of the triceps. Origin is going to be the glenoid cavity of the scapula, okay? Kind of just along the edge of the glenoid cavity, I should say. It's not in the socket itself. Obviously, that would be problematic for your range of motion. But it's kind of on the edge of the glenoid cavity and the posterior portion of the humerus, okay? That makes sense, right? Up in this general area. And then insertion is on the olecranon process of your ulna, which we talked about last week. Okay, that's how it's allowing for the extension of your arm. It's that bony process. It's attaching around here, and then when this muscle contracts, it pulls that arm straight, pulling the olecranon process upwards, or more proximal, I should say. So yeah, extension of the forearm and elbow. Then we have the bicep brachii. Okay, we have the coracoid process. That is the smaller. It is more anterior and more inferior process on your scapula, coracoid process, and the glenoid cavity as well. And then insertion is on the radial tuberosity, okay? Very straightforward, down on your forearm. That allows for flexion of the arm, okay? Okay, muscles of the forearm. These guys tend to be a bit problematic, so we'll spend a little bit of time on them here. We have multiple slides to provide different perspectives, and then we'll circle back to it again at the end of this when we go through the actual model. So the brachioradialis, I like this one because, as I mentioned in lecture, it kind of acts as a delineator between your extensors and your flexor muscles, the general physiological function. It is the large ridge line on, how do I angle this? This large ridge line here along the side of your arm. So it's very obvious on your own body. And then basically everything on the outside or the posterior surface is going to be extensor muscles. Okay, so like these guys. It's weird because the camera is like reversed for me. And then everything on the anterior surface, or like think of like the front or the inside edge, is going to be your flexor muscles. All right, pronator teres. So a quick note with these visuals, these are of a 3D model. In this particular instance, we're looking at an individual, we're looking at the palm of their hand. So this is their arm down by their side, okay? Whereas in this case, we're looking on the posterior surface. So here we're looking on the back side of their arm, the kind of, well, that's not super helpful, but like the back side of their arm, okay? Posterior surface. Just bear that in mind when we're looking at these two pictures. So this is the palm, this would be the back of the hand. All right, so pronator teres is going to be on the anterior surface, okay? It is running from basically your ulna, and then it's kind of crossing over more towards the radius, relatively on the upper proximal end of the forearm. Then we have the flexor carpi radialis. So quick little like mental categorization note. Note that we have flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris, and then we also have extensor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi radialis. So there's kind of a natural pairing here that's going on between flexors on both the radius, like bias to the radius side and the ulnar side, and same thing with extensors on the ulnar and radius side. Okay, so just kind of like put that little like mental categorization that'll help organize your thoughts. Flexor carpi ulnaris, we're going to be looking over here because we're looking on the flexor side, and then obviously your radius is this bone over here. Your ulna is the more medial one in anatomical position, so we should know intuitively to look on that side of the body. And so the flexor carpi ulnaris is running right along the edge of the ulna. Cool. Then we have the flexor digitorum superficialis. So this is one of those muscles that's kind of trying to trick you. Okay, it's a little bit counterintuitive in terms of its name. Superficial being in the name, superficialis, superficial. So many words, so many syllables. Superficialis suggests to you that it should be at the superficial surface. That's only kind of half true, okay? This is actually, on the flexor side, there are 3 layers of muscles, generally speaking. This is going to be in the middle layer. So it's technically superficial, but it's superficial relative to the most deep layer. The other flexor muscles that we're discussing, the flexor carpi radialis and ulnaris and that sort of stuff, are technically on the layer above it. So they sit on top of it on the model. We'll note that when we get to it. But that is going to be the middle layer, and that's running to your digits 2 through 5. We'll talk about it more in a moment. And then we have extensor carpi ulnaris and radialis. Okay, so that is going to be this guy right here. So extensor carpi ulnaris, so that is running along the ulna. Okay, and then the radius is over here. Okay, so other things, I think, yeah, that's noted over here on the radius. So it's going to be on this outside edge. And then extensor digitorum. Okay, so that is this fairly large muscle right here. Again, running to your digits 2 through 5. Okay, not your thumb. Your thumb has its own stuff going on. Speaking of those two muscles highlighted in red that we need to know, okay, so with the flexor, flexors attach generally to the medial epicondyle, okay, the inside edge, whereas extensors attach to the lateral epicondyle. And since we're obviously much more focused on gripping things rather than extending our fingers, over the course of your life, both early on and as you grow older, the medial epicondyle tends to be larger because it'll physiologically, Wolff's Law, it'll physiologically adapt to strain. And so since we're generally putting more strain on picking things up and holding things in grip strength, the medial epicondyle will tend to be larger than the lateral epicondyle. So yeah, and then insertion is on the phalanges of digits 2 through 5, and that's how we flex our fingers inward. And then extensor digitorum is going to do the exact opposite, right? All right, it's opposing that force. These are agonists, antagonists to each other. So that is along the lateral epicondyle. Again, that mirroring thing is going on. Phalanges 2 through 5, and this is extension. Okay, so just categorize those two in your head as basically being opposites of each other. So I added this picture as well as the following one. This is going to be a little bit different to my students. This is a little bit different than what I added this picture. This one wasn't in your PowerPoint. It is in your textbook, so you do have access to it. Just wanted to provide another visual of some of these muscles. So again, we can see our brachioradialis, that big long guy that's kind of delineating between our extensors and our flexor muscles. We have flexor carpi. Radialis, okay, so that's inserting over on the radial side. We have the palmaris longus, okay, over here. Cool. Again, we're talking on the flexor, so this is an arm like this, okay. So we're looking at the palm of the hand. The palmaris longus, that was one that not a lot of people, or a small portion of the population, do not have. I looked it up. It's around like 15% of the population don't have that. And so if you can do this pinching motion with your fingers, kind of like basically like doing like a shadow puppet face, and you don't get this one particular ligament, tendon poking out, then you may be one of those percentage that do not have this muscle. Don't worry if that is the case. Your grip strength is perfectly fine. There's a tiny bit of loss of grip strength in like your pinky and your ring finger. But aside from that, you will be just fine if you want to do rock climbing or farmer carries or deadlift, that sort of stuff. You'll be doing just fine. It's a very minor contributor to grip strength. So yeah, this is just basically another perspective on the muscles that we've already discussed. And this is going to be the same thing for the extensor side. Okay, so we can see the extensor digitorum right here, extensor carpi ulnaris, that sort of stuff. Yeah, just wanted to give you guys another perspective there. But moving quickly because we're already at like 40 minutes. Muscles of the leg. Okay, so we have the muscles of the quadricep. There are 4 components of the quad, as the name implies, although ironically, none of them have a quadricep in the name. But we do have a natural pairing with 3 of them. So we have 3 vastus muscles. We have the vastus medialis. We have the intermedius, which is we'll note this in a moment. It's in the middle, in between the two. And then we have the vastus lateralis. Now, sticking point for students, the rectus femoris and the vastus intermedius are stacked on top of each other. The rectus femoris is the more superficial component. Directly under the rectus femoris is where the vastus intermedius is. Okay, so they look very similar because they're occupying the same space, but they are stacked on top of each other. Okay, so the rectus femoris is the more superficial one. If you popped off, especially on our anatomical models, if you take off the rectus femoris muscle, you will see that the vastus intermedius is below it. Okay, so that is those 4. Very easy to identify. Then on the posterior portion, some of our main drivers, so those are extensor muscles, our main flexor muscles. We have the bicep femoris. Okay, this is going to be the more lateral component. I'll start doing my outlining thing again here. So this is the more lateral side of our flexor muscles. My lines are not very good, but that'll do. Then we have the semitendinosus and membranosus. And for all intents and purposes, the tendinosus is mostly sitting on top of the membranosus, okay? Especially with our models. It tends to be basically on top of it. And then the membranosus is this little sliver that I'm trying very carefully to outline right here. Okay. It is slightly medial, but primarily deep to the tendinosis. Okay. Yeah, those are those. Sartorius. This is widely considered to be like the longest muscle. Oh my gosh, that line is so terrible. Like it's terrible enough that I can't live with it. Let's see if this is any better. Whatever, slightly better. This guy right here. Okay. Basically crosses over the anterior surface. I play video games with controller. Okay, I'm not a mouse and keyboard guy, so you can see why. Lack of practice. Crosses over the anterior surface of the upper leg of the femur. Then we have the adductor magnus and longus. These are somewhat confusing. Okay, so here we have the longus right here, and then the magnus is this little tiny slip. It's much easier to see on the physical model, as we'll see in a bit, but it is there. We can actually see it in two different spots, but just from this perspective, we can only see that tiny little bit of it that I just outlined right here. And then we have the gracilis, which is on the medial. It is like the most medial edge muscle over here. Pectineus, kind of another contributor. It's functionally similar to like your adductors. This guy right up here. Okay. And then we have the tensor fascia latae. Okay, tensor fascia latae. Honestly, we're not really gonna use this picture. We'll look at this more on the physical model. Tensor fascia latae is associated with your IT band. Okay, this is a part of your knee. Quick physio side note that I mentioned in class because I think it's fun. Sometimes you'll have a popping sound with your knee when you do like an extension, and your knee just generally feels tight. A common point that a coach or a PT might recommend to help with that is to sit leg down on with a roller and roll the upper outside edge of your quad, basically this region right here. Okay, so you're basically perpendicular to the roller and you're rolling the outside upper edge of your leg. You might be like, well, coach, no, the problem is down here. Like this is where my knee hurts. Well, the thing is your IT band. So this is actually the tensor fascia latae. You can see right here. The IT band is this long strand of connective tissue that runs along the lateral surface of your knee. And by massaging the musculature up here, we can relax tension in that, and that will in turn decrease tension lengthwise in your IT band and hopefully end up loosening your knee. Isn't this artwork so beautiful? Alrighty, moving on. Oh, and then we have gluteus maximus. Come on, we all know our glute muscles, right? All right, so that is this big guy right here. Again, there are two other gluteal muscles, but we're just going to focus on the gluteus maximus for now. All right, muscles, the quadricep. Okay, so again, we have the rectus femoris. This is the more superficial of the two, and then below this guy is going to be the vastus intermedius. Okay, where does it insert? Well, the rectus femoris inserts on the acetabulum of the coxal bone. Again, acetabulum actually translates basically to cup, or it's a special kind of like dinner cup from ancient Roman times because it comes from Latin. And then obviously on the ilium, okay, on the upper portion of the coxal bone. Insertion is on the patella and the tibial tuberosity. So it's inserting on the patella, which is this bone right here. And then the connective tissue that's running this whole length technically runs over and around the patella. So it attaches to the patella, but then it runs past the patella. And then it inserts on the tibial tuberosity, which is going to be like right about here. Okay. So that's why it says that. And that's obviously important because this is extension of the knee, right? So we need attachment to the tibia to basically pull the leg forward, right? Pull it out like that, kind of, whatever. Alrighty, what else do we need to know? Bicep femoris. So the bicep femoris, again, it's the more lateral of the flexor muscles on the posterior portion of the knee. Origin is on the ischium. That is the base of your coxal bone. This is what you're probably sitting down. This is what you're probably sitting on, the coxal portion of your hip. And the upper femur. Okay, so it is attaching there as well as over here. And then insertion is on the fibula and the condyle of the tibia, right here, over here. Okay, this general region. So we would have the fibula head of the fibula right here on the lateral edge, and then this is the condyle of the femur, or condyle of the tibia, sorry. And again, this is flexion of the lower knee, okay? Like bend our leg. Muscles of the leg on the lower leg. All right, so we just have a handful that we're going to talk about here. Again, there's more, but this is an introductory level course, and we're already at 50 minutes. Oh my goodness. All right, so we have the fibularis longus, and the name should be very good hint as to where the location is. We have the fibula, which is going to be on the lateral edge. This is a left leg that we're looking at the anterior surface of in this particular picture. And so if it is on the fibular side, well, it's going to be the most lateral muscle over here. Okay, fibularis longus, this guy along the edge. Cool. We have the gastrocnemius. When you think of calf muscles, you're typically thinking of two muscles. The two heads that you think of, those two kind of lumpy portions, are the gastrocnemius muscles. You see somebody with like crazy calves, they probably have big gastrocnemius heads. There's two muscle bellies to that. The other is the soleus muscle down here. Okay, so that's kind of forming the majority of the rest of what you would think of as the calf. We'll talk more about the gastrocnemius in a little bit. Then we have the tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior is this guy right here, running next to your tibia, as the name suggests. So like we have the fibularis longus next to the fibula. We have the tibialis anterior, which is on the anterior surface of the tibia. Crazy, I know. Minor cases of shin splints are sometimes associated with basically, minor trauma to the muscle fibers or to the connective tissue attaching the tibialis anterior to the tibia itself. Severe cases of shin splints are oftentimes microfractures in the tibia itself from impact. Very common for soldiers during like long rucking if they're not physiologically adapted to that sort of heavy weighted running, that sort of a thing. Or, individuals that start doing long distance running without much time for adaptation. Wolff's Law, again, the body will adapt to the strains and to the stimulus that you give it, but that process takes time, particularly with connective tissue that is less vascularized than, say, like muscles and that sort of stuff. And then last two muscles down here, okay? Flexor digitorum longus and hallucis. We'll start with the hallucis. Hallucis is just this tiny little guy that we can visualize right here, okay? Just this little sliver on the anterior surface. And then wait, what was the other one? Oh, flexor digitorum longus. Okay, flexor digitorum longus is going to be this guy right here on the medial surface. Okay, the medial surface of the tibia. And that's going to conclude it there. Last thing we need to do is talk about origins and insertions of the two muscles down here. So on the gastrocnemius, we have origins on the medial and lateral condyles of the femur. It makes sense because we're helping bend our leg back. So we need a good anchor point to pull against. So these are the two condyles. Again, the way the knee looks, something like I did a terrible drawing of this in the last lecture. Okay, so this would be the anterior surface, and then this would be the posterior surface. And then these medial and lateral condyles, we'll just call this the medial condyle here. And then this would be the lateral condyle here, okay? Makes sense, so it's attaching to these two guys right here. And then insertion is on the calcaneus, this big bone right here. This is forming the majority of what we would think of as your heel, okay? It's your heel. And then we have the Achilles tendon that also is inserting down here, okay? Plantar flexion makes sense, right? If these muscles contract, so if we take this length and then we reduce it, okay, we're going to end up pulling this way. If we pull that way, then we're going to take our toes, and our toes are going to, the sole of our foot is going to move down in the direction of the plantar fascia, right, which is the sole of the foot over in this area. And so by angling our foot downwards is plantar flexion. And then tibialis anterior, okay. Clear up my terrible drawings. Tibialis anterior, lateral condyle of the tibia makes sense. Ooh, get my laser pointer back. Lateral condyle of the tibia. So again, this is the lateral surface over here. So it's attaching up there. Makes sense. And then insertion on the metatarsals. And this is accomplishing dorsiflexion. So this is picking our foot up, lifting our toes. And that is going to be it for this PowerPoint. Brief pause. Good job. 55 minutes in. At least that's what the timer says for me on the PowerPoint. I don't know if that's exactly necessarily when I started recording. Hopefully it's a bit shorter than that. Now we're going to jump over to a different lecture. Bear with me one moment. All right, so we're going to do on the physical models. This is going to be much faster. This is the part, if you felt good about everything that we talked about this far, that you should mainly focus on because, again, this is going to be the content of the exam. So that being said, let's go ahead and hop on in. Hop on in. I'm tired. It's a Sunday. All right, so we have the epicranius. It is this. I'm just going to use the pointer because everything's going to be already highlighted. We have the epicranius right here. Again, also we have a posterior portion of this muscle, but we're just focusing. That's why it says 2 numbers. So there's like 5 and then 9 would be on the back side. Cool. Orbicularis oris, running around the eye. Okay, that name is very much a big hint. And oculi, you should think eye. Orbicularis orbit, you should think circular. Okay, so is this big guy right here. Cool. Levator labii superiosus. Again, this is going to be more on the lateral surface. I'm sorry, on the medial surface of the muscle. Zygomaticus is going to be this big guy over here on the side, attaching to what you would think of as your cheekbone, also involved in like smiling and that sort of thing. Then we have the depressor labii inferiosus. Okay, the mentalis is these 2 little halves right here. Lateral to that being the most medial. Lateral to that, we have the depressor labii inferiosus. Okay, and then we have lateral to that, we have the depressor anguli oris. Okay, so we have these big portions right here. Then we have the orbicularis, so still a circular muscle. Oris being oral, being mouth, being speaking, all that sort of stuff. Like an oral exam, like where you have to explain everything that you learned. You can't just write an essay about it. You have to know it off the top of your head. So orbicularis oris can be that guy right there, part of your mouth. And then the mentalis, this is the most medial muscle on the mandible. Okay. Then we have the buccinator. Okay. Buccinator. Okay. Buccinator and masseter are right next door neighbors, but again, think of this as more of part of your cheek. And then we have the masseter, which is actually your bite force. Okay, on the angle of the mandible. And like kind of the border of the mandible. That is your chewing muscle. And then we have the temporalis on the temporal bone on the side of the head. Makes sense. Neck muscles. Let's keep it rolling. So we have the platysma. Again, is this guy when you kind of strain your neck, your mouth out to the side. That very most superficial muscle. It's the platysma. Then we have the sternocleidomastoid. All right, I think that should be becoming one of our favorite muscles because once you get that name, you know everything about it. It's, again, this big guy right here. And then we have the scalene muscle. Again, there's 3 different subcomponents of it, but we're emphasizing 2 of them right here. So 30, and technically you also do that one. I'm with you guys in class. I mainly emphasized this labeled one right here. This is the middle scalene's muscle. All right, then we have the digastric. Okay, it is attaching up here, and then onto that hyaloid bone. So on the mandible and the hyaloid bone, again, it's involved in helping open your mouth. Okay, pulls your jaw down. So it's attaching back here at the kind of at the angle and the front portion of the mandible. All right, moving on to the torso, we have the pectoralis major, most superficial guy. This is your chest muscle, right? When you're doing your tough bench press. Under your arm on the upper portion. So again, we have your obliques. That's going to be your lower portion, kind of more along your rib cage. And then up directly under your armpit, we have the serratus anterior muscles, okay, the more forward-facing portion of that. Then we have the deltoids, your big boulder shoulders, okay, big guys over here on the side. All right, we remember those. Then we have pectoralis minor, not visualized well on any of our models because it is deep relative to the pectoralis major, okay? Then we have the external and the internal intercostals. We'll kind of lump those 2 together. So obviously internal would be the side you could see from the inside the rib cage. Oh, I'm in the wrong direction. But internal and external intercostals, again, we associate they're located in between your ribs, and their physiological function is to help with respiration. Increasing the size of the thoracic cavity, which again allows increased size of lung volume, creates negative pressure, pulls air inwards, right? All right. Then we have the diaphragm. Diaphragm is delineating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity and is involved in respiration. Most of the time it's involuntary, although we do actually also have motor control over it. Fun fact. And again, this is involved in breathing. So when this contracts, we can pull in on the abdominal cavity, increase pressure within the thoracic cavity and force air outwards. Then we have rectus abdominis, the most superficial layer. These are your abs, your six-pack abs, all right? The number of abs that are possible is not purely a consequence of how much ab work you do. It is actually genetic with how many insertions there are of the rectus abdominis muscles. Most people have 6 visible, abdominal muscles, but if they have additional pairs of muscle insertions, they may have 8 or sometimes even 10 in rare instances. Then we have the external obliques. These are the outside edges of your abdominal cavity, directly adjacent to the rectus abdominis muscles. And then we have the internal obliques, okay? That next layer on the inward inside surface, okay? Over here. And then, of course, we have the transverse abdominis. So this would be the internal obliques. And then we have the transverse abdominis, okay? These are running perpendicular to your rectus abdominis, which was the most superficial. Now we're on the most deep layer of your abdominal cavity muscles. Switching on to the posterior surface of the torso, we have the trapezius muscle, named for its shape. This is a primary driver of pulling motions, of back posture. If you're carrying things, think of like a farmer carry, okay, down by your side. This is maintaining tension on your shoulders. When you pick up all the groceries to get back inside the house in one trip, you're probably utilizing a lot of your trapezius muscle to hold your arms up on your sides. Then we have latissimus dorsi when you need to do a pull-up or any sort of that sort of a motion, or a rowing motion, any sort of large pulling thing. You're utilizing your latissimus dorsi muscles. Again, these are inserting down on your spinal processes as well as on the iliac crest of your coxal bone, if your pelvis. We have the infraspinatus muscles, okay, these guys right here. Then over here, I'm just gonna kind of jump ahead. The teres minor and major are these two guys right here, so make sure you keep those straight in your head. But this guy, the infraspinatus, because it is below the spine, it is attached to the scapula, but it is below the spine of the scapula. And then speaking of teres minor, we have teres minor right here, okay, so it is the upper of the two teres muscles. It is the more superior one, meaning just higher up. I'm not saying it's better than, just saying it's higher than. And then below that, inferior to that, oh goodness, this is too zoomed in. We have teres major. I'm going to go back to this one, and how about we just highlight it real quick. 10. Teres minor is this guy right here, okay? This guy right here. Make sense? Yes, yes, yes. All right. Then we have the supraspinatus. That's not correctly labeled. I'm going to skip that one. I didn't make this, but yeah, that's not right. Levator scapulae, okay? Attaching to the scapula, it's on the outside edge. Levator, it is pulling on your neck. Think higher up. Then we have the rhomboids, major and minor. Rhomboids, again, so trapezius is this is more superficial over here, and then this is more deep over here. So this is going to be the minor, okay, that we see right here. Oh my goodness, my drawings are so bad. And then we have rhomboid major below that. Okay, again, these are stabilizing your back, pulling your scapula in sort of an adduction motion towards the midline, keeping it also just close to your axial skeleton, so your whole shoulder and arm is stabilized for whatever motion it's doing. Then we have the semispinalis, which again is kind of like the upper 2/3. These exist on the upper 2/3 of your spinal column, helping stabilize your spine as well as parts of your neck. And then we have the erector spinae muscles. These are the primary drivers of spine stability on the posterior surface. On the anterior surface, we end up relying on intra-abdominal pressure. So basically our ability to compress, again, all those abdominal muscles that we talked about. And we compress those. Fluids don't like compression, right? And so if we can compress this whole cavity and all the fluids within it, we can support the spine from the anterior surface over here. Oh my goodness. On the anterior surface, think of that being in front of the spine. And then here on the back side, we have these erector spinae, spinalis muscles that are stabilizing the spine on the posterior surface. We have the tricep brachii, 3 heads, okay? It's technically lateral, long, and medial, but you don't need to know that. Just note on the anatomical model that it is these big guys right here. Okay, cool. We have the bicep brachii. This is on the anterior surface or front of your arm. Oh my goodness, I'm getting excited with my drawings. All right, and bicep because it has these two muscle bellies, okay? If you're super jacked, you can see the subdivision when the muscle matures, but for most individuals, that portion isn't very uh, self-evident. Looks like we're skipping over the brachialis, so I'm just going to note that right now the brachialis would be this guy over here, again on the lateral surface. Kind of, I'm not even going to bother trying to show. Well, it's that very faint line that you see right there, okay, on the lateral edge of your arm. Brachioradialis is that big, large guy that I like to use as a delineator between your extensors and flexors, okay? So good starting point. Oh, there it is, brachialis. All right, so I was like, oh, it's got to be in here somewhere. So this, yeah, it would be this guy on the outside edge. So then this is bicep in between it, and then tricep is back over here. Okay. All right, pronator teres, relatively minor contributor, crossing over the anterior surface of the arm. Flexor carpi radialis. So this guy is going to end up crossing over and then inserting. So these are kind of in opposite orientations, the two images from each other, but it basically crosses over the anterior surface, kind of like how we're seeing it do right here, and is going to insert down on the radius over here. Okay. Palmaris longus. Okay, going to digits 2 through 5. Cool. Flexor carpi ulnaris. I don't really like that picture. I didn't make all of the, I didn't make this PowerPoint, so I'm going to not emphasize that one so much. Use the other models for that one. Flexor digitorum superficialis. This is the one that's only telling you a half truth again. So if I was to zoom in on that, is there a way I can do that? Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know you could do that. Okay. Okay. Yo, this is cool. Discover something new. Wait, no. Discover something new every day, right? Pen. Does it not let me do both of those things at the same time? Oh, that's so dumb. Okay. Anyways, it is deep to this line sucks. We're gonna try like draw it out, and then we're gonna zoom in on it. Okay, that's kind of helpful. But yeah, you see how her pen is pointing to, like, again, the inside edge of the shape that I just made. It's visual. It can be visualized on the model, but it is deep to those muscles on the most superior or superficial surface. So it's that middle layer. Anyways, I'm spending too much time on this. I got really excited for a moment and then really sad. Extensor carpi ulnaris. Okay, so we're dealing on the extensor side of things. That brachioradialis that I was mentioning earlier, that's this guy over here. So right now we're talking about this muscle right here. Okay, that is going to be the extensor carpi ulnaris because our ulna would be right along here. Okay, that would be where our ulna is. And then extensor carpi radialis. Let me get reoriented here. Yeah, okay. So this is the bicep right here. Okay, so if we wanted to flex the arm, we would be moving it in this direction. So this is that outside surface. Yeah, I'm not even going to try with the camera. But we have the extensor. So brachioradialis right here. Okay, and then next door neighbor, extensor carpi radialis. And again, that's going to run down the length and then be over on the radius, which would be down over here. All right, extensor digitorum longus, extensor muscle, big guy on the very center of the back of the hand. And again, this is going to run if you track with it. If you're getting like, oh, which one is this? You know, is this the extensor carpi radialis or is this the extensor digitorum? Well, look at which fingers it's running to. This one is going to have tendons that run to each of the digits 2 through 5. Okay, just as you see right here. So if you're able to track that and it's superficial, if it's very superficial and it's tracking to all 4 of those digits, you're probably looking at the extensor digitorum. All right, sartorius, that long muscle on our legs that crosses over the anterior surface. Don't need to highlight it. You can see it right here, very obvious. Not a big muscle, but pretty unique. Okay, and then the adductor magnus. So we can actually see this in two locations. So not only do we see it right here where she is currently looking, but let's see. It would be down somewhere in this region. There's another portion where you can see adductor magnus. Okay. Adductor longus. So the magnus was back here. Okay, so that was magnus that she was pointing at, right? So this is this. Okay, and then the second portion of the magnus. We're not talking about longus yet. Of the magnus is this guy right here. So it kind of runs like this, but it runs runs deep to the gracilis muscle, which is running over the top of it. All right, now in reference to the adductor longus, that adductor longus is this guy right here. Okay, cool. Then the muscle that's running over the top of the adductor magnus is the gracilis right here. Again, this is the very medial surface of, this is a left leg. This is a very medial surface of, as we can see here, of the leg. The pectineus muscle, little guy right in here. Okay, kind of small contributor to the same stuff as the adductors. And then rectus femoris, not the best picture, but it is this big guy right here. Again, of the quadriceps, it is the superficial one in the middle. All right, and then under this is going to be the vastus intermedius. So if we popped this whole muscle off, okay, if we pulled this whole thing off in the same spot, we would see the vastus intermedius. That is wrong. Don't use that. That's wrong. I don't know what they were doing. The vastus intermedius is this guy right here. So I should maybe make this PowerPoint myself. Again, just trying to utilize a resource that someone else gave me. All right, vastus intermedius is the lateral. I'm sorry, vastus. This vastus lateralis is this guy right over here. Okay, so on the lateral surface, because this is a left leg. And then vastus medialis is this big guy right here. So this is pointing correctly. And then intermedius, again, below the rectus femoris. Tensor fascia latae. Okay, this is correct. So it is this muscle belly right here. And then this long band that we see right here. That was probably one of my best lines. Is the IT band. Okay, I was mentioning earlier. IT band. All right. Almost done. Gluteus maximus, big guy. This is the majority of what you think of as your butt. Cool. Bicep femoris on the flexor side of your femur, bending your leg. Okay. The lateral big muscle is the bicep femoris. Okay. It's labeled 3132 because if you pop off, like if you take it off and you were to look under, there would be a 32 under it. I know it's weird. Don't worry about it. Only relevant if you did the lab. All right. Then we have the semitendinosus. Okay. I think the mnemonic I like to use for this is the tendinosus is on top. Okay. Tendinous on top, and then membranosus is below. So it is this big guy right here. And let's see what they do for the semimembranosus. Yeah, membranosus. Okay. So it's going to be this little portion. I'm actually going to go back to this picture. I'm going to erase my line. So semitendinosus, again, is what we just talked about. I don't know what the heck this is. The semimembranosus, you can see right here, and you can also see a little bit of it if the angle of the camera was shifted over to the side. You'd be able to see a little bit of it over on this side as well. So again, membranosus is kind of below, tendinosus is on top. Fibularis longus running next to the fibula. Yeah, that's fine. On the lateral surface. Okay, then we have the gastrocnemius. We have two heads of the gastrocnemius. We have this one and we have this one. For the majority of what you think of as your calf. Tibialis anterior. So this is your shin right here of your tibia that you can feel on the front of your leg. And then directly on the lateral surface of that, you can feel a big muscle, and that is this guy. That is the tibialis anterior. Okay. The soleus muscle. It is under the gastrocnemius, so we're seeing it here. So if we took the two heads of the gastrocnemius off, which would normally be like right here, right? So when we remove those, then we can see the soleus muscle, which, as I mentioned before, the gastrocnemius and the soleus basically are the majority of the volume of what you would think of as being your calf muscles. Then we have the flexor digitorum longus. This is on the medial surface. This guy right here. Okay. Flexor hallucis longus. I would use none of these pictures to see that, because it's the easiest place to see it is on the front of the leg. But all right, we'll kind of skip that one. And then, yeah, we mentioned these already. Cool. That is going to be all. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to make sure to like, favorite, and subscribe. I'm just kidding. No one cares about this YouTube channel. Best of luck during your study prep. And yeah, do well on the exam. And until next time, cheers.